and a study into suicide by armed forces veterans, the first of its kind in the UK, is calling for an urgent review of the mental health services which are meant to support them. Yeah, the report is called One is Too Many, and it found a range of issues that's led to unnecessary deaths. Our reporter Alison Freeman met the parents of veteran Ben Richards, who died in 2019. Some viewers may find her report upsetting.
He always wanted to be a soldier. His bedroom was just covered in posters of military. When only 16, he went to the Army Foundation College.
It was the life and soul of the party. I think that was reflected at his funeral when the funeral director estimated about 500 people. Most of them his former comrades from the army turned up for his funeral.
Ben was 30 when he took his own life. It followed a number of failed suicide attempts and numerous conversations with mental health professionals. It was on his return from a tour of Iraq that his family noticed serious signs of trauma.
There was an occasion Caroline was woke up in the middle of the night. Ben was in the toilet washing his hands and he was asleep. He was saying, "I've got to wash the blood off my hands, I've got to wash the blood off my hands."
He was burning his hands under the tap.
That's when we suspected there might be problems.
As he got worse, his family tried to get help from senior officers at Catterick Garrison for suspected PTSD.
And I was told there's nothing they can do unless he goes and asks for help himself. Well, back in those days, that's the last thing a soldier would do because of the stigma of mental health within the armed forces.
Ben was discharged from the army and struggled to engage with a variety of mental health services. He died in 2019. Ben's mum and dad are now among more than 20 families who've told their stories to researchers at Northumbria University for the One is Too Many study into veteran suicides. The study, which is the first of its kind, found disjointed, overstretched and inconsistent mental health services, as well as a lack of understanding of military personnel.
Ben he would come across as being aggressive, but he wasn't being aggressive. He was trying to mask his vulnerability. And our caregivers don't recognise that because they're not trained or educated in dealing with the veterans.
The report's authors spoke to hundreds of mental health staff and bereaved relatives and found similar stories of missed opportunities over more than a decade.
The crux of it is, if we want to save lives, then families need to be involved. The biggest message that the families have kind of articulated to us, there were times when there could have been an intervention, or they've spotted something but no one would listen. To keep reading that over and over again, it is, for us as a research team, it's a significant finding.
We often talk about people slipping through the net. What can be changed to stop that from happening?
We need to remove the net because people fall through the holes in the net, and we need to move to a safety blanket.
The study makes a number of recommendations to help mental health organisations improve and prevent unnecessary deaths, like making sure families are included in care plans.
If people had listened to us when we was saying that we have these problems with Ben, we know Ben is our son. If they had listened to us, then maybe he might still be here.
Alison Freeman, BBC News.
We're joined now on the sofa by Claire Lilly, whose ex-husband Alan took his own life in 2020, and by Professor Matt Kieran, who led this study. Morning to you both. Claire,
morning.
If we could just start with you. You have spoken a lot in the past, I know, about the trauma that your former husband had survived. Just tell us what happened to him.
So prior to him taking his own life in 2020, we were essentially watching this whole train wreck, if you like, play out as a family for the best part of 19 years. And then Alan obviously sadly took his own life after being missing for a period of 3 days. And it became evident really in the inquest that when you look at the timeline from when he left the military to you know, passing away, there was actually various points that there could have been preventative measures implemented by one body or another. So, yeah, prevention, there were missed opportunities for prevention.
And for the people closest to him, it's almost maybe sometimes, are you so close that you can't see that from that outside perspective? Do you need someone else to be keeping an eye on him?
Well, obviously, we wanted the professionals to intervene and implement that care and give him the tools to cope. For me personally, I worked for the military for 16 years alongside the military, so I kind of had a bit of an insight into the psychological makeup, if you like, of the military mindset. But obviously, a lot of family members and friends aren't afforded that insight.
And Matt, you undertook this study, and we heard in Alison's report there, the care for families, passive, often disjoined, uncoordinated, deficits in understanding, families that felt they weren't being heard, understood or valued. Why is it so lacking in help for families?
That's really the really interesting question, because as you know, with this study, we did it on, there's sort of three parts to it. So that first part, as you quite rightly identifies what the families have told us. The second part, which was the co-production, where we actually brought the families in, we brought in those service providers, the nurses, the doctors, the government policy people, and we put them together. And even in that area, you can feel that frontline clinical staff just feel so constrained when trying to work with families, you know, because they're constrained, they feel, by GDPR, they're constrained by confidentiality. And it's not a simple fix. I think that's one of the things from the study where we don't like saying it, but we're saying, actually, that's where we need to do further work, because we actually need to be able to help in not only the health services, but it's social services, it's the military charities, to work with families better. And we actually need to start looking at that, and how is that? Because unless we can get over the confidentiality, the GDPR, the barriers, because we talk about barriers, there's barriers in the way all the time. We need to work out how we get past those barriers, because they've got to be involved in the care.
So what does that mean in practical terms then? Does that mean that someone maybe in Claire's position who's desperate for help, you know, wanting outside help, isn't able to find it because of confidentiality, maybe?
Well, if you look in the report, I mean, we have many of the families telling us that they weren't allowed to ask for help on behalf of the person that was in distress, you know, and we've got to find a way around that, you know, because generally, being a former clinician myself for 25 years, you see somebody for 1 hour, for the other, you know, 6 days and 23 hours. It's the family that care for them, and they need to be able to express and be heard if what's happening. And of course, the other thing that came through really clearly was when that person's made the decision on what they were going to do, things calm down. And so, you know, the families can pick up the changes, they're telling them, and, you know, we saw it through multiple stories where it's not good, it's not right, something's going to happen. It's, as you were saying, Claire, isn't it? It's like a train that's going down the track and you know the eventual destination, but you're trying to get that across.
And Claire, is it fair to say we're talking here a lot about the help that's available when someone has been diagnosed, but actually diagnosing PTSD is really difficult, and a lot of people aren't diagnosed properly, particularly after serving in the armed forces.
Yeah, properly. I mean, obviously, the terminology sort of PTSD covers a broad spectrum of kind of complexities, you know. So, but I think, yeah, it's just. I think there are the professionals out there. It is possible, obviously, to diagnose, but it's kind of what are the tools to cope is what I want to know. You know, what are those tools? I'd like to see more of kind of EMDR and things like that being utilised within the services, because I think there's only so much value. Not that I'm not advocating this, but, you know, going to a GP and sort of being prescribed medication doesn't really cut the mustard. There needs to be more in place, more tools.
And what are the problems when PTSD is undiagnosed?
Anger regulations, drug and alcohol misuse. They're all seen as criminal activities, if you like, when actually these guys are self-medicating. Their pain, their emotional pain, because they're not being heard, they're not being understood, they're not being given the tools to cope. Yeah.
And Matt, how hopeful are you that as a result of this report that things will start to change? Because it's a huge problem and it's difficult to know, as you've outlined, where to even start, because there's so many elements to it. Are you hopeful things are changing?
Well, we are, because I think we didn't... I mean, what the simple thing we could have done is just written this first part of the report and say, here are the problems, there we go. But we didn't do that. So with the co-production we talked about, where we actually start to get the solutions, then the third part of the report is really the way forward, because this is the framework. Because what we talk about now is creating safe environments. So if you're accepting a care setting, you know, when you're caring for people, that there's always going to be risk. So actually don't look at trying to predict that risk. Actually look at how we make the environment safer. So if people do fall over, if they do relapse, there's actually, we talk about a blanket. It's a safety blanket that we wrap around the care system. So that final part of the report that we've done is the first step in the framework of assessment, where we're going to ask and we're going to hopefully work with a lot of the trusts now and the military charities so they can start to assess themselves against what the co-production did was they actually articulated what good looks like. And that's really important. That's not a new thing, because the NHS do that quite extensively when they do their toolkits. If we know what good looks like, how do we assess ourselves against what good looks like? Then we know the action plans to put in place to start improving care and closing some of those gaps.
Solutions rather than problems, really.
And go on, what are those solutions, Claire?
Like you're saying, the wraparound care, I would like... You've got the single points of contact that the OVA and the Defence Minister have created, like your Op Courage, your Op Nova, your Op Fortitude. There's this single care pathway, and then outside of that...
So
there's
that's kind of systems within...
Yeah, so it's knowing where to turn in the first instance, and then they utilise over 2,000 charities and entities that are veterans specific, but I think getting them into the right place and then moving out, and then the whole system in itself is constantly evolving at a rate of knots, really. I would say in the last year we've seen a significant change in veterans care, but more does need to be done. This toolkit that, you know, Matt's talking about needs to be utilised effectively. The families need to be listened to. We've kind of, you know, we've got the misfortune of hindsight, if you like, but you know, prevention is ultimately the cure. So,
thank you both. Really interested in the language you use as well. That's so important, isn't it? That you fall over. This is just a blanket to put around someone, and it's so important to recognise it as exactly that. Matt, thank you so much for being with us and talking to us.
And we do have a response from the Army this morning. They've actually said our service personnel are our most valued asset. We have improved the support provided to enable our people to recognise the signs of mental health distress in themselves and in others, and to encourage them to seek help earlier.
Yeah, the government says something similar. They say they've got a commitment to support veterans, bespoke mental health pathway, they say, for veterans in England, backed by over £17 million a year of investment. So some work being done. Thank you, though, to you both for telling us your story.
Thank you very much.